生きる者が必ず持つ肉体が精神や魂といった未知の可能性を秘める存在にまで限界を作っているのよ。
たとえそうだとしても、姉さんが望んでいるのは自然から与えられた人の力を超えてる。それは危険な力だわ。
そう、その通り。私が欲しいのは選ばれた者が手にすることのできる新しい世界への扉をこじ開ける力よ。
人間は決して神にはなれないのよ。
Pushing the envelope can be risky, but very rewarding when you nail it. Following the successes of Ace Combat introducing the franchise and Ace Combat 2 perfecting it, the developers at Namco got experimental. The third title distances itself by surrounding its gameplay in a huge, near-future sci-fi setting and gives the player access and incentive to explore every aspect of it. Not only is it way more involved than its predecessors and contemporaries, it is still the most plot-heavy entry out of the entire series. It's also so far removed from the tone of Ace Combat titles before and after, sidelining the 80s and 90s inspired moods of the other two PS1 games and the outright power fantasies of later games in favor of a much more tranquil and melancholic atmosphere. At the same time, a lot of the groundwork is also laid here for establishing the series' future identity with a shift towards focusing on characters and introducing mainstay gameplay elements. Released in 1999, Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere at its heart is still the same plain game we've come to know and love, with all of the fast-paced dogfighting and ground attack gameplay that the series entails, but presented in an incredibly unique manner. The player once again takes the role of a faceless pilot, callsign Nemo, but they're no longer a heroic mercenary called to squash military coups. Rather, Nemo is employed by an organization attempting to maintain an uneasy peace between opposing megacorporations. Skirmishes fire up, leading to a shooting war between the two companies, forcing the peacekeepers to intervene. But the conflict isn't as clear-cut as initially thought, as throughout the story it is revealed that key events and individuals have been manipulated by those looking to grab as much power as possible while the war has everyone distracted. These revelations come to Nemo through their choices and performance, as Electrosphere's standout feature is the branching timelines for the story, allowing the player to take part in every facet of the war. Before getting into the prospect of the big changes, however, there's the core structure of the gameplay, and as stated, its base is more or less the same as previous titles. You're given a briefing, a choice of aircraft, and thrown into the fray. If there's one detraction to make from this game, it's the briefings are a downgrade from 2's neat 3D simulations to something much flatter. If it was a resource limitation, I can't say I blame them for making this cut in particular, especially given the amount of briefings that this game has, but it does kinda suck that the previous game had a much cooler interface for them. On the selection of aircraft, given that this is the future, all of the planes are fictional, though more than a few are based on modern airframes. You no longer have to purchase them once they become available, but the selection is dependent on your current faction and progress in that particular branch. Most aircraft will be unlocked through general progression, and switching sides can open up a whole new range of options. Sticking with UPEO and General Resource will offer you mostly upgraded future versions of current planes and giving our boy his well-deserved day, while NEUCOM gives you completely fictionalized aircraft with unique designs. I'm a bigger fan of the more familiar angled stylings of upgraded 4th and 5th generation fighters than NEUCOM's smooth curves direction, but the R-103 is pretty neat. Additionally, certain levels may call for something completely circumstantial as required by your objective, therefore giving you only one option. Next comes what you're loading onto your hardpoints. Introduced in 3 is the option to swap out weapons, rather than only having machine guns and missiles. Admittedly, the selection isn't too varied in this one, mostly pitting a number of faster, weaker, and higher quantity missiles against those with higher damage and shorter range, though a few planes offer air-to-ground options like bombs. Even your Vulcans can sometimes be swapped out for heavier cannons, but again, it's mainly damage versus distance argument. I found myself choosing stronger missiles and lighter machine guns since the heavier bullet drop and rate of fire on cannons didn't mesh well with my playstyle, but I'd always be close enough to use mid-range missiles. Also, don't worry, if you happen to choose ground attack weapons for a mission and you find yourself up against airborne targets, you can still launch normal missiles by locking onto them, though they will also drain from the same ammunition stockpile. And pro tip, don't fall for using the MIRV. Once loaded into a mission, you're greeted with a very slick HUD and an overall nice looking game. You've still got access to your in-game map and radar, altimeter and speedometer, but in first person your horizon line and compass are integrated into a circle surrounding the pilot. Given the way that cockpits are designed in Electrosphere's setting, foregoing canopies and traditional hands-on throttle and stick setups for cameras and piloting done by the mind, the first-person presentation matches what a pilot would actually see in that type of interface. Ace Combat 3 also continues the tradition of Namco's late PS1 aesthetic, which I'm going to go ahead and say is my favorite look of this particular generation. The art direction is terrific, and the in-game graphics also look fantastic. Similar to the progression of Ridge Racer's visuals, colors are no longer as vibrant and saturated as possible. With R4, Namco aimed for a more cozy mood with its visuals, but not here. Muted shades of hazy skies contrast with futuristic urban sprawl to give the game its melancholic atmosphere. And it looks good. Everything looks better than ever, with just the right amount of detail used where needed. Plane models still look great to this day, regardless of their low polygon count, really selling the varying design philosophies of each company. Better tracer effects cut through the smog, showing your allies' engagements. Missiles no longer have little smoke sprites following them, but proper trails, making air-to-air exchanges look that much better. The game also offers the excellent lighting techniques found in R4 that became emblematic of Namco titles around this time. The sky grows deeper in color the higher you climb as you escape pollution, the air thinning out. The sun starts to blind you when flying into it. The ground itself is surprisingly detailed, and even though some corners are cut with structures being drawn flat on it, there's more than enough detail leading to a cohesive environment all around. Those environments themselves also vary in types of location, involving mostly futuristic urban settings, but there are more than a few locations that stand out. Aligned with this change in aesthetic is the music, which also goes against Ace Combat traditions. Whereas Ace Combat 1 and 2 have upbeat rock solidifying their 90s setting, Electrosphere matches its time with a futuristic sounding electronic suite of music. It fits completely. Many of the mission songs are no longer in your face nearly as much as something like Fire Away or Rising High, but instead offer a quieter, sometimes almost otherworldly sound. Of course, there are exceptions. Physical Layer, for example, brings in an electric guitar and is nowhere near as pessimistic as the rest. But this matches the mission in which it's played, where the player is participating in a harmless training exercise with a fellow ace pilot. Track of the game, though, which is one of more than a few to bring in some drum and bass to the soundtrack, goes to Montage. This song encompasses the game's entire mood and is the first thing I think of when somebody brings up AC3. The gameplay itself has a few new mechanics thrown in. The first thing you'll notice with a flight model is how heavy everything is now. You may be pulling back on the stick, but each plane can only turn so quickly, leading to a heavily momentum-based set of physics. This is the most aggressive inertia gets in the series too, so even veterans of the later games will have to take some time to get used to it and won't be able to pull out of a dive at the last possible minute. These heavier physics cooperate well with the fact that stalling is very easy in this game, making recoveries that much more difficult. Truly, the most dangerous threat to you in Electrosphere aren't the numerous skilled pilots or SAMs, but flying a little too low and flying a little too slow. That said, stalls are nice and smooth and don't force you into an immediate nosedive, so you can incorporate them into your dogfighting tactically. Speaking of dogfighting, enemy and missile behavior continues to be improved. Enemy fighters fly in formation and break as soon as they're engaged, and will bait and attack you with their advantage in numbers. To balance this out, missile guidance is much smarter now. They can still be defeated easily enough if you're firing haphazardly, and on harder difficulties enemies will be quick to shake them. But when a plane attempts to dodge, your missiles are much more responsive to recalculate trajectory in order to make the hit. This is also the first Ace Combat game to introduce a few camera movement controls that were desperately needed and remain in the series for their usefulness. The first is the ability to swing the camera around in either first or third person, allowing you to look in all directions. Simple enough, but AC1 and 2 did not have this given the DualShock wasn't a requirement. The second, and one of the most useful features, focuses the camera on the currently locked on target, activated by holding the next target button down, by default triangle. As long as triangle is held, the camera will follow the current target, giving you a better sense of where your enemies are and where they're heading in relation to your craft, though it's important to maintain spatial awareness and continue to pay attention to which direction your plane is going. This makes dogfighting so much more fun, with the chase camera acting as your head on a swivel to keep an eye on bandits. Another thing I want to mention about the immediate gameplay is how each mission goes. In AC 1 and 2, when you're given a briefing, it lays out everything that's going to happen in that mission. There are a couple of exceptions, chiefly having to chase down that cruise missile that gets launched in AC 2, but apart from those, everything plays out pretty straightforward. AC 3 isn't necessarily too different in this regard, but the situation can change drastically depending on your actions and how effective of a pilot you are. There's often no longer an explicit mission timer in-game, though a number of stages show a desired limit in the briefing for accomplishing your objective. You can still complete missions after going over, but you'll be chided for a poorer performance and given a D rank. Conversely, by succeeding in your objectives within the time constraints, you may gain additional missions and objectives, which in turn can make some moments hit even harder.
ずっと考えてる。もう止められないのかな。でも、姉さんにもう一度会ってちゃんと伝えたい。あんまりバカだからしょうがないでしょ。ねえ、私が悪いんじゃないでしょ。ねえ、そうだって答えて。
Lastly, AC 1 and 2's missions instantly end upon the destruction of your final critical target, but AC 3 gives a brief moment of pause whenever you win in order to fill some story or let you to relax for a moment. You're still vulnerable until the screen fades to the debriefing, and while your plane would autopilot and could crash into the ground in AC 2, you'd still have the credit for the mission completion minus the aircraft replacement costs. Oh. Oops. Crashing in AC 3 before the screen fades completely will cause a mission reset, like my friend That Homestar found out one time.
Oh no! That doesn't count!
Most importantly though, Electrosphere is the first game in the series in which flying solo is no longer a player's choice. There's no more optional wingman for hire. Allies are much more emphasized given that they are established characters participating directly in the plot, sometimes even at the center of it, and will always be joining you with a few exceptions. They'll engage targets on their own, sometimes chiming in with a battle cry or encouragement, though nowhere near to the extent of later games' mid-air chatter. However, there are plenty of scripted lines. This is the defining improvement tying gameplay to the plot, as it is this decision to make each major ally an actual person that makes me care what happens to them. In Ace Combat 2, for example, if I were to hire Edge for a mission, she's more of an asset with a cost-reward balance based on whether or not I need someone flying cover or hunting down targets in a separate part of the area of operation. I never even need to hire her. I could do every stage solo just fine if I wanted to. If the mission were to call for her to get shot down at some point, I wouldn't feel much of anything other than maybe be annoyed at losing her hiring fee, but I can easily make it up in kills I'll get myself. On the contrary, if Reyna were to become incapacitated as part of the story, I'd be heartbroken. She's already been through so much with her sunlight will kill her disease and the whole being a child experiment. In spite of her afflictions, she's been a valuable ally and expert pilot during our sorties and has rightfully earned her position as flight lead. In between missions, she confides in me about her past and asks for the two of us to try and find the one piece of it that may still be around. So yeah, I'm gonna disobey direct orders and go with her instead to search for it. Her growth and involvement during these missions solidifies her importance as my teammate in both gameplay and the story, which makes scenes like this much more impactful.
Contamination level 30%, 40%. Warning, cannot restore system, 70%, 80%, 90%, 100%.
I'm done stalling. The main draw to this entire game is its story, and the hype lives up to the expectations. Ace Combat 3 is set in the year 2040, a not too distant future where nations no longer have the final say on the laws of the world. Instead, megacorporations operate outside the confines of borders and dominate all aspects of life. AC3's plot focuses on the events leading up to and through a war between the two biggest conglomerates, General Resource Limited and NEUCOM Incorporated. Nemo begins working for the United Peace Enforcement Organization, UPEO for short, navigating small but increasingly aggressive spats between the two as part of a special mediator squadron. This is not Nemo's only path, as at two key moments while working for UPEO, they have the option to defect to one of these two opposing sides. Furthermore, at a certain point in both of the General and NEUCOM branches, a fourth faction becomes available, leading to two additional branches. These paths lead to one of 5 possible endings with a total of 52 missions, though each branch will only last you about 18 or so levels. With all of that effort put into storytelling, the multiple paths gimmick works out more than well enough. Ace Combat wasn't a stranger to the campaign branching out, with 1 allowing you to choose whichever missions you wanted to do, and 2 having hidden alternative stages, and a split where 2 distinct sets of missions are available, but both of those still involved you fighting the rebels from the side of the government forces. AC3's branches in those scenarios would have allowed you to join the rebels and turn the tide of the war in their favor. It's not butterfly effect levels of variance between the paths, as most of the story's major events and battles will occur at the same points each time. The variable of your allegiance can cause details and what leads up to those major events to change. This allows for a strategic reuse of assets like maps and mission design, but also approaching them from every conceivable angle recontextualizes character actions and events, and can even offer certain parts of fights unique to that side. There are also times where only one faction is a factor, leading to distinct missions that define each branch's identity, and these are the most memorable missions of their respective timelines. In any case, a branch is completed by playing to the end and saving the clear data, which can be cheesed by using multiple save points, but don't do this. The game is designed to be played through entirely those 5 times in order to contrast the key event missions with each scenario's unique stages and available information. If you treat it like some do visual novels in order to not replay earlier missions, you miss out on hints towards the big picture and the importance of major events being so static in the timeline. If you're coming from one of the later games, 18 missions may seem like a lot to play multiple times, but in reality these stages go by fairly quickly.
Engage. Bullseye. Mission accomplished.
A playthrough of each branch lasts roughly 2 to 3 hours. There's a nice chart made by Sly Cooper Fan 1 floating around that depicts all of the splits and potential additional missions, so if you're worried about missing the points where you need to change course, it's useful to keep on hand. The big faction switching divergences are obvious enough, requiring you to literally follow your chosen ally with the game telling you decide, but a few of the alternative missions also use this loyalty choice, while others require a speedy completion of your objective. That said, it is your playthrough, so feel free to play however you see fit and make the choices you want. If I had to recommend any semblance of an order for which branches to do, I'd say at least start out by staying loyal to UPEO, and make the final playthrough defecting to OUROBOROS from General. That one in particular tips the game's hand too much near its end and is best saved for last. So who are these factions exactly? As stated before, UPEO is the peacekeeping organization formed by the Neo-United Nations as their enforcement branch, with the Special Armed Response Force as the outfit equipped for military interventions. UPEO finds its purpose in regulating the rivalry-turned-hostility between General Resource and NEUCOM, both based out of the fictional continent of Usea. General Resource, the older of the two, is composed of many different divisions that operate in varying industries covering almost all facets of life, and also have their hands in military R&D complete with their own armed force. NEUCOM is the newer corporation, formed from the merging of an airliner and the Usean Air and Space Administration, and would make their focus on advancements in scientific technologies, also gaining its own security force. The game opens with the two heavily provoking one another to the point where NEUCOM initiates an operation against General as part of what they claim to be retaliation. UPEO dispatches fighters to intercept this first attack, shooting down bombers and jets as needed. Throughout the beginning of the game, NEUCOM continues to be the instigator to the point where General Resource and UPEO begin working a lot closer, running training exercises together and even sharing aircraft designs. Given their past of UPEO being seen as an unspoken extension of General, these actions don't make for a good public image of UPEO's alleged neutrality, even as UPEO's representative works his best to attempt negotiating a ceasefire. It's eventually successful, but the peace is clearly not going to hold, with General already using the pause to conduct its own aggressive acts. This swings UPEO into NEUCOM's corner during the lead-up to a peace conference aimed at hopefully settling things down for a more permanent truce. The conference never happens one way or another regardless of Nemo's actions or loyalty, and tensions reach a boiling point leading up to an actual war. At this point, a fourth faction makes its appearance, the terrorist organization OUROBOROS. They're revealed to be the manipulators guiding General and NEUCOM to fight, as well as pushing UPEO to take a more aggressive stance via co-conspirators present in all three groups. Ouroboros' stated goal is to force the next step of evolution, humanity into the digital realm, with consciousness unbound by the physical limitations of the body. The titular Electrosphere, effectively the internet but much more expanded in scope and capability, will become the new home of mankind as the population undergoes the process of sublimation, the copying of a person's entire being, personality included, into a digital form. The war comes to a head with UPEO, General, and NEUCOM all aiming to stop Ouroboros, while also coming out on top of the debris. Each path is marked by the faction you're aligned with, but at the heart of this game are the characters. Ace Combat 3 has a sizable cast of pilots, scientists, and politicians, all with their own individuality, affiliations, motivations, and backstories. Starting out in UPEO, you fly with Fiona Fitzgerald, an upbeat pilot who also relays sortie orders to the squadron. Eric Yeager, a pilot who's very cautious about the motivations behind said orders, and Reina Hirose, a quiet prodigy ace who becomes the flight lead of SARF and seems to have connections to the behind-the-scenes players of the war. Also at UPEO are two non-combatants. Gabriel Clarkson, an old-fashioned politician who represents UPEO and believes traditional negotiating methods to be the answer, and Gilbert Park, a former General Resource Officer turned commander of UPEO. With the General Resource Defense Force, there's Abyssal Dijon, an aging ace past his prime and seemingly disillusioned with the state of affairs, and Keith Bryan, who's a little hot-headed and quick to initially be wary of others, but a reliable friend. In the NEUCOM emergency unit is Cynthia Fitzgerald, a proponent of NEUCOM's scientific advances and the older sister of Fiona. Also at NEUCOM is Simon Cohen, a scientist working with the military applications of artificial intelligence. Throughout the game, they'll communicate with you through either video messages or during the in-flight segments and accompanying cutscenes, and the best part of this is the full voice acting. It's really well done work, with all of the voice actors and actresses giving excellent deliveries. The writing for all of these characters is done well, making them mostly fueled by emotions but always trying to maintain a line of logic in order to keep those emotions in check. They'll have to fight those impulses hard as most of them go through the ringer. A number of events shake these characters to their cores, tearing them down and not always leaving them in better positions than when they started, or even worse. And with so many characters and opposing factions, there is no ending where everyone is better off. Someone will always lose as a result of Nemo's intervention. For this, I'm going to go into heavy spoilers, primarily focusing on a single character, but ambient spoilers for endings will entail as well. Please skip to the following timecode if you would not like to hear them. Let's circle back around to Reina. As SARF Starling, she is one of the game's most promising pilots, recognized for her innate talents and determination to complete her objectives. It hasn't always been so easy for her. As mentioned earlier, she suffers from Silverstone disease, an illness that disables the skin's ability to protect a person from the sun's E-rays, forcing her to wear a spacesuit when outside. For further isolation, she was also the test subject for Darkness of Enigma, a secret research project by General Resource in order to combine next-generation aircraft with better neural interfaces. After having cybernetics surgically grafted to her nervous system, she was able to fly the X-49 Night Raven, a truly terrifying jet, but this experience granted her the freedom from her ailment she desired.
人間としての心まで捨てて手に入れたこの翼だけは絶対に離さないって。
The project was shut down after General decided the pros of Night Raven's performance did not outweigh the cons of human experimentation, and the research team was swallowed up by NEUCOM. Reina would eventually move on to UPEO, and the game's events play out. While chasing a General Resource recon plane through a canyon with Nemo, Reina begins to recognize the location, and memories resurface about the project, and the man she met that convinced her to go through with it.
ずっと前に誰かとあの人。
Trying desperately to seek out any other leads towards the whereabouts of the Night Raven, Reina and Nemo launch without clearance but are met with Dijon, who is also seeking the experimental aircraft.
翼を取り戻しに来た。
あれは私
Oh my.
のあなたのものじゃない。
General is repelled, and the two SARF pilots' insubordination is swept under the rug. By the way, this mission is only available if you stay under the radar detection of the canyon run, further emphasizing the importance of completing your objectives properly. The X-49 is later recovered by UPEO from a train, eventually falling into the hands of Ouroboros through Park's secret alliance with him, along with Reina herself. This acquisition is even a mission that Nemo participates in should they align themselves with Ouroboros from NEUCOM. In every timeline, it is destiny that Reyna reunites with Dijon and the Night Raven in Ouroboros, and should she stay loyal to Ouroboros, as is the case in most branches, she will fly the Night Raven and cause the destruction of NEUCOM's artificial city, the Megafloat, but this will also cement her fate to die, or in one case be rendered comatose. By all accounts, Reyna would be the one member of the cast to agree most with Ouroboros' stated objective of human sublimation, at least for her own sake. She's always viewed her ailment and by extension her body as something that has kept her back, even publicly wishing to discard it entirely in her introductory cutscene.
ただ最近思うのは、体なんて人間にとって心の入れ物でしかないのなら、私には意味のないものだなって、いつも心で飛んでるんです。体には翼がないけど、心の翼が私に空をくれたから。
However, should Nemo stick with UPEO past the conference escort and more importantly stick with Reyna, a pivotal moment occurs that throws all of this into question. In a mission unique to this route, SARF is called to contain self-replicating nanomachines called nanobites that are running rampant. During this mission, Reyna's flanker gets too close to one of the clusters and gets infected, along with herself due to her neural enhancements. The nanobites flood her brain as she begins to lose her mind. This situation is easily defused by Nemo with one of the dispersal bombs used in the mission aimed at Reyna's cockpit, stopping the infestation and saving Reyna. After the mission, Reyna calls Nemo to further explain her past and connection to Dijon, explaining her actions as fulfilling a promise to herself about how she'd do anything to get the Night Raven back. But after Reyna was faced with the terror of losing her consciousness, she realizes she was mistaken about wanting to abandon her body, for it was her body that houses and protects her mind. With new resolve, she flies to Ouroboros alone when they make their appearance, and finds both Dijon and the Night Raven on her own terms. Initially, she appears to go along with their recruitment, but upon launching the X-49,
ディジョン、私はあなたを許せない。
レナがなぜ落ちた。
Eric and Nemo carry out the destruction of Ouroboros and assassinate the traitorous Park, only to return to the Night Raven's crash site later that night. It's revealed that Reyna survived the crash as she discards the spacesuit and neural lace. She's won her freedom, but not from her sickness. Freedom from her past, from the Night Raven, and from Dijon. That's the true nature of Electrosphere's multiple paths. Major war events may stay etched in potential histories, but each ending results in wildly different outcomes for these characters. Most branches focus on one in particular, having Nemo as their steadfast ally in a world where everyone seems to have ulterior motives. Things may not end up the best for them, but at least they have a friend to help them get through their strife. With one major exception, but that is actual endgame spoilers. But on the note of timelines, that's an interesting topic, the game's place in an overall universe. Given that the two prior games were their own thing and this is simply the next step, it's easy to leave this in the original classic Ace Combat setting, extensions optional. Since the game also takes place in 2040, a period that hasn't been explored in the current Strange World continuity, it's possible to put these events at the end of that timeline. Plenty of hints in more modern titles suggest that Ace Combat is heading back towards it, and it's not too much of a stretch to retcon minor details to make it fit. Of course, the true canon timeline that Electrosphere fits into is the best possible outcome, the United Galactic Space Force timeline, which contains a number of classic Namco arcade titles such as Galaxian, Galaga, Dig Dug, and Cybersled, with Ace Combat 3 being the first entry. This is real. Bandai Namco did this in 2011. No matter the case, Ace Combat 3 remains a unique point in whichever universe it belongs to. At least, one of them does. This leads to the story of two very different games. If you find Electrosphere interesting enough to check out, don't rush out to get this one. or this one. Everything up to this point has been about the original Japanese release. The version developed for international markets, both the NTSC and PAL releases, was the victim of a hard business decision that resulted in an incomplete and vastly inferior product. Ace Combat 1 and 2 both sold well and returned a decent profit to Namco, so naturally the developers had a bit more freedom with budget when it came to 3. Not only did they throw in more content than the first two combined, but hired production IG to create cutscenes and character animations, considered to be a worthy investment. Upon its release in Japan, the game did not sell as well as Namco had hoped, overall barely passing Ace Combat 2's sales and falling substantially short of Ace Combat 1's. Initial consumer reactions were also reportedly mixed, generally positive regarding the gameplay itself, but the interludes did not receive as much universal love. As a result, Namco's US division made the decision to cut a vast amount of content that would have cost even more to localize, seeing the risk as too much to take on. The saddest part about this decision was that Ace Combat 3 had already been advertised to contain all of the original content in overseas markets, so when the announcement of the changes became public, fans were more than disappointed. It's hard to say exactly how well the game would have done at that point in time, though I suspect it probably would have been fine. I can easily point at Metal Gear Solid concerning itself with heavier political intrigue and finding a vast share of the market, but in general, this was the era of good sci-fi action mixing with involved storytelling. I think the landscape was right for Electrosphere to fit right in. A quick confession. Up until now I have only stuck with playing the Japanese release when I play 3, but I had to know how bad the international version is, and wow. Even when not played back to back, it's a bit shocking how bare bones this version is. The export edition of Ace Combat 3 contains the slightest traces of its plot, still depicting the rising tensions and war between General Resource and the renamed Newark Incorporated. The worldwide release only has 36 of the 52 missions presented as a linear story with no branching paths. The cutscenes are gone, with the only remaining evidence they ever existed in the game's OP. Furthermore, the biggest and most important part of Ace Combat 3, the characters, are all gone. Not only having no mention in any of the intermissions between levels, but the few missions I did play don't even have them replaced as unnamed allied aircraft. The only one I could find was the remnants of Dijon, instead referred to only by his aircraft of F-15S/MT Eagle Plus, which makes sense because that particular mission requires you to follow him practicing flight maneuvers, and it wouldn't work without following someone. None of the in-mission dialogue is voiced, as to be expected, but unlike AC-1 and 2, even the briefings are no longer voiced. It was at this point I completely gave up hope and only played for a little bit more before calling it quits. Overall, I would strongly recommend avoiding this release because it's that much more of a depressing experience. Sure, the core gameplay of the flight segments is still there, but it's such a neutered product. Enter Project Nemo, a group of fans who undertook the task of translating the original version to English, and in December 2016 released the first version of the Ace Combat 3 International Edition patch. All the story content is translated and subtitled, including cutscenes, and a portion of the in-game world-building archives are as well, though selecting a couple of entries in particular will crash the game. This patch is currently on version 2.0 as of the time of this video, with an update containing even further translations of the data entries announced to be coming at some point. The easiest way to play this will be through an emulator. I'm on EPSXE, but it does appear to also work on modded consoles should you be able to play burn discs or have an SD card slot or optical disc emulator. Will AC3 ever be revisited? Because it never officially released in its intended form over here, as well as the fact that it is an older game, it's a ripe choice for a remake. So you might think. While Project Aces is more than willing to acknowledge Electrosphere, developers have been quick to shoot down any possibility of a remake when asked about it in interviews, and if I'm being honest, I don't necessarily disagree. Skies Unknown definitely put Project Aces in the green for more games, but doing Electrosphere again as close to its original presentation would be a huge undertaking. Missions would have to be reworked because sub-minute long operations are not going to fly today. If they were going to try and make it similar to a more modern Ace Combat game complete with their linearity, the point of the original's format would be lost. I can definitely see the time period being revisited. There's plenty of room to maneuver around in 2040 when most of the Stranger World games take place between 2004 and 2019. There have been hints and references to the rise of General Resource and NEUCOM, most recently in AC7's DLC missions, so it does seem like the franchise is more than ready to return to the corporate future. But as far as Electrosphere itself is concerned, there's really nothing wrong with playing it how it is now. In its current form, it's way more than adequate. it's still a damn good game and one of the PlayStation's late classics. If they could pull it off, more power to them, but I'd hate to see any of its charm lost in an update. I 100% recommend Ace Combat 3. It is truly a game unlike any other, especially taking into consideration its genre, but with one major stipulation. Since it is not representative of other games in the franchise, don't use it as your starting point for the series. You've got plenty of choices for first games to try, and AC3 has a bit too much going on to use as a beginner's entry. If you're a person that likes to start a series from as early as possible, I recommend playing Ace Combat 2 and then continuing on to 3. If you want something more modern, the next few games in the series offer you the perfect stepping stone. Thank you for watching, and for those who waited on this one, thank you for your patience.
I have so far to go.